It's a book, as the title suggests, about pleasures, a multiplicity of possibilities, in which the central thesis seems to be that we're led to believe, and psychoanalysis plays its part in this, we're led to believe that the real site of our enjoyment is that is under the sign of the forbidden. And that by an emphasis on this, what gets lost in the shuffle are a whole host of unforbidden pleasures. So much so that these unforbidden pleasures can become in some way disavowed, forgotten about, denigrated, degraded in some way. And it looks as if it's part of Adam's project to in some way sort of revive, to restore, to renew an interest in those unforbidden pleasures. This seems to be part of what my reading is, that very gradually, little by little, we get a sort of manifesto, an Adam Phillips manifesto of what would constitute some elements of a good life. They're faintly reminiscent in some way of a book, an introduction to a book by Foucault, a book that's mentioned a number of times in Adam's latest work, the Deleuze and Guattari Anti-Oedipus book. In there, Foucault, in a very short introduction, has a rather wonderful little checklist of what would constitute the ordinary life of a non-fascistic way of being. And similarly, there's certain sort of crucial elements of Adam's manifesto. But one of the things about this issue of the forbidden pleasures, what it immediately reminded me of was that when I was quite young, I would think possibly about the age of 6 or 7, I'm walking, I think, with my mother in some woods. And as I'm walking through these woods, and really sort of not particularly interested in the woods, this side or that side of the path that I'm walking along, I come across a sign saying trespassers will be prosecuted. I think those signs are actually quite rare nowadays, and I miss them, because immediately that's exactly the part of the wood that of course I wanted to go in. Now whether that's representative of anything, just my perverse state of mind, or whether actually it speaks to almost all of us here, and judging from some of the titters, yes, it looks as if it might. And what I want to start off with is asking Adam is what's his understanding, what's his analysis of how that has come about? Why are we so in some way, I think the word you used from Wittgenstein, bewitched by the forbidden?
I'm really not knowledgeable to answer that question, which I suppose would be kind of historical and culturally located. Mm-hmm. But I do think, just in terms of the small bit of the world that I know, that on the one hand you could think the forbidden is integral to childhood, in the sense that one of the things involved in parenting is not simply and solely the Oedipus complex, but children, and we all as children have been forbidden from doing certain things. In other words, it begins protectively. Now, it can be more or less punitive, and it can be more or less tantalizing, but I think it begins, broadly speaking, protectively. But of course, as children, we observe the fact that the adults do the things they forbid the children. And the adults are often saying, do as I say, but not as I do. And so there's always going to be, in the forbidding of something, a temptation is being created, or a curiosity is being created. And I think that's unavoidable. Now, hopefully, your curiosity about sort of running across the road without looking is not experimented with, but there are loads of areas of experience where, as you get older, you begin to want to experiment. And my guess would be, broadly speaking, that we experiment with the things that have been connoted as forbidden. So there's that. Then there's the more obviously psychoanalytic Oedipus complex side of this, which seems to me, obviously wasn't invented by Freud, it was invented by small children and their parents, which is that if you have children or know them or were a child yourself once, you'll remember that we did have these desires to be with the parent of both the opposite and the same sex, and we were aware of the parents taking a position in relation to this. It was very clear to us, for example, that we could or couldn't sleep in our parents' beds. It was very clear to us that there were certain things the parents did together that we as children couldn't do. But in those examples, of course, there's a promise of the future, which is one day you will grow up and you'll be able to do whatever it is the adults do, which you can only mostly fantasize about. So I imagine that, in a sense, the origin of the forbidden in whoever we are, our immediate lives, is to do with both looking after children and also, in a way, protecting their development by not allowing them or tempting to do things they're actually unable to do. I think I refer in the book to a French psychoanalyst who says, Grunberger, who says at one point, the reason the father stops the little boy sleeping with the mother is because were the little boy to sleep with his mother, he wouldn't be able to satisfy her, nor would she be able to satisfy him, because actually it's impossible. So Grunberger's point is, the father, if we take the basic Oedipus scenario, is protecting the son's future potency by preventing the child sleeping with the mother. Now that seems to be a perfectly pragmatic, intelligible account, one account of an Oedipus complex. The reason that there's an Oedipus complex is to protect the child's future development, not to thwart its pleasure. And, of course, there's a real sense in which children's fantasies of their pleasure are way in excess of their capacities. So there has to be some forbidding. That's my long answer to your question.
There's a follow-up question, because in the book, it looks as if, because of this emphasis on, if you like, the sort of forbidden delights, the transgressive, the position, the heroic, in inverted commas, position of the outlaw, that, as I say, that what gets lost in the shuffle are these unforbidden pleasures, multiplicity of possibilities. As I say, that they in some way seem to be sort of forgotten about, downgraded in some way. And it's not entirely clear to me, and again, I'm looking to see how you might answer that, why that should be so. Why, fair enough, if one particular set of pleasures, if we have this sort of dividing them up into forbidden and unforbidden, not splitting them up, that's pathological according to Marion Milner, but just allow there's difference. And if there's a valorization of one, the forbidden, why would that necessarily mean there seems to be a suppression of this whole host of unforbidden pleasures?
I think there are various bits to this, and of course, in a way, the book is partly about this. I think one bit to it is that there's, and again, this must be something of a cultural assumption, but it must have some physiological basis, which is that when we are most excited and most endangered, we're likely to feel we're about to have the realist experience available to us. In other words, there's something about something that feels dangerous that's linked with something that's forbidden. So that's one bit of it, and I think that's likely to make us think, not unforbidden pleasures are so boring, but they're just fine. We don't need to think about them or talk about them. That's just what we do. And then there's the whole world of risk-taking and courage and bravery and all that stuff, which in a way my book is kind of against, in a way, saying that if you privilege forbidden pleasures, it's a way of not talking about most of the pleasures we have, because most of the pleasures that most of us have are unforbidden. And again, it seems to me not that everything is to do with childhood, but if you think of the origin of this, most of the pleasures of childhood are actually unforbidden. And most of our everyday play, I mean, how much time can you spend doing forbidden things? Not that much. So that, even if you're, as it were, a professional criminal, there's still going to be a limit. Most of your day is going to be spent sustaining yourself on, hopefully, unforbidden pleasures. Now, the book is written partly to say, because it's arranged like this for whatever reason, our conversations or our language about pleasure is severely diminished. There's lots of exciting language about exciting, dangerous pleasures, but there's very little language about most of the ordinary pleasures. So for me, it's partly to do with imagination, which is we've been induced to imagine forbidden pleasures much more because they're forbidden. What else would we be imagining? Whereas the unforbidden pleasures, like having a cup of coffee, why would you want to think about that much? But there could be something very immediately and intensely pleasurable about that is kind of set aside or taken for granted. So that's really the point. We're being instructed about what to desire by the forbidders. And I think that's a shame because it's so limiting.
This seems to lead on to certain elements of what I'm dubbing your manifesto. This sort of idea, and I think what I'd really like to say is something that I think is absolutely crucial in the sort of conversation, and it is to underline something of the tone in which this book is written, because at no moment is Adam taking up the place of a forbidding presence. There's a whole seriality of, if you like, sort of hints, suggestions, encouragements, proposals, ways forward in a certain way, and at no moment is he laying out a sort of set of rules or a laying down the law. And that seems to be absolutely crucial, because in many ways it's, of course, and part of its charm, immensely seductive. There may be certain problems lurking in the margins, which we may come to later, but it's very important, I think, to emphasize that issue of the tone. Not so much that, the content, in a way, takes care of itself. Now, that seems to be one of the this issue of the forbidden and the unforbidden. But what if there's a whole area that in some way, in a sense, sort of frames this issue of desire and the use that we put desire to? And it seems here again that psychoanalysis plays a considerable part in relation to this. And I'd like to set off with a particular quote from the book. And it says, this is you, Adam, "There may always be things we care about more than the things we care about most." Now that seems a very intriguing and very interesting statement, but it seems to suggest in some way, and this is what psychoanalysis seems to want to in some way insist upon, that we never really know what we want. And if we think we do know what we want, we're in some way in error. And I think just for a moment that I would like to problematize that.
Which bit?
So, well, all of it. But the idea that this statement, you see, that we may always, there may always be things we care about more than the things that we care about most. Which seems to suggest there's a whole lot of stuff that we're unconscious of, if you like, more genuinely wanting. So what do we do with what we're conscious of?
Well,
when we say that,
I think I think the point of the sentence, which obviously in a way is a contradiction, is to say we are largely out of anxiety and the need to survive. We have to be conscious of our pleasures to some extent. But we're likely, I think, to be more unconscious of the pleasures and desires that are more troubling or more conflictual for us. So that I think what I'm saying is we might have a quite rigid sense of what or who we like most. And this is a way of both expressing a preference. It's also a way of narrowing our minds, that it creates a kind of internal security along the lines of, I know what I want. Even though I can't have it, I know what I want, or I know what I like. Now, what interests me about psychoanalysis, not only about psychoanalysis, is that it seems to me it starts from the assumption that, in a way, the whole knowing project is based on an anxiety about the fact that A, it might be very difficult to know what one wants, and B, that it might change or evolve. In other words, that a want might evolve in the context of a relationship in which wants and needs are kind of discovered rather than simply met. So what the sentence of the book holds out for is that there's an unknown repertoire of things and people we might enjoy that we might be unwilling or we might feel unable to engage in. So it's like a sort of phobic model of the mind in which you think, I know exactly what I want, and if I stick to that, I'll be fine. And in fact, what one's doing is fundamentally narrowing the repertoire. So it's like not allowing oneself to be as receptive as one might be, not to the whole world, sort of infinite possibilities, because obviously attention is selective, but it might be, we might have been educated, if there is a we in this room, to be extremely selective in terms of our attention. So for example, Marion Milner talks about wide-angled attention. She says, if you want to paint an object, look at everything around the object, but not at the object itself. Now that seems to be a very interesting picture of what it might be to desire, which would be, there'd be wide-angled vision. So there wouldn't be over-focus, over-concentration. There'd be the possibility, say, of being surprised. So you're not organizing a pleasure, you're organizing the preconditions for a pleasure you don't entirely know about.
Well, one of the elements in the manifesto seems to be a wish to see if we could find our way to, in some way, a less oppressive morality. And again, this seems at a certain level sort of enormously seductive. Why wouldn't we sort of want something of that order? But to return to this issue of the one who says, yes, actually, what I want to do, if you like, sort of an instance of perverse state of mind. We might dub it in that way. They might say, okay, I'll buy this thing about the sort of the wide lens sort of view of the world. But on a Friday night, I want to dress up in a Nazi uniform and get whipped. And this is going to be between consenting adults. We all know quite what's in store. And I know that I really enjoy that. It's not all I want in my life, but I want that. And the difficulty is that the proposal, and this very seductive proposal, that in some way we're engaged in something that's limiting and restrictive, in sort of saying, look, I know what I want and I believe in the plausibility of that particular knowing, and this closes me off to all these other possibilities, seems as if the wish to have a less oppressive morality starts actually to become rather oppressive in its own right.
It could do, but it needn't, in the sense that this person you're describing, it seems to me this would only be a problem, so to speak, if that person felt it was a problem or somebody else in their environment did. So you present this to me abstractly, and I can say, well, that's fine. I mean, they can do what they like. But if somebody with this particular problem comes to see, say, one of us, or indeed talks to their friends, it's because whatever they feel about their pleasure, they have a doubt. Now, I would say your doubt could be the most interesting thing about your pleasure here. In other words, I would say that this so-called perversion is a conversation stopper. And I would be, if somebody did come to me, I wouldn't do this publicly, but if somebody was to come to me, I would do a combination of, in the ordinary analytic way, trace something of the history and the preconditions for this. But I would also, in a non-psychoanalytic way, be doing a version of persuading somebody that actually the thing that most excites them is actually an attack on their pleasure, because that's my prejudicial belief. Now, of course, they can disagree with me. We could have a conversation about that. But my assumption about the scenario you're describing is not that it's fabulous, although that's one of the things it may be, but my assumption is that the other thing it is an attack on something else. And that's what I'd want to explore. Not that I know it is, but that it could be. Right. That would be my kind of moral position. Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is actually sort of trace out, operate a bit like a sort of trailer for the book, go through one or two or three sort of salient points that are there. One is, what I'd like you to amplify, to expand on, is, I think, a rather wonderful thing that you talk about, the idea of a self-centeredness and having an idea of self-centeredness in its best sense. And this comes from certain things that Oscar Wilde, you've culled a number of things from Oscar Wilde that seem to be really very, very interesting about this whole issue of how, in some way, because it's as if we're led to believe that what we're really here on earth to do is in some way sort of live for the other, and that this in some way sabotages the possibility of us living with the other.
Winnicott said, madness is the need to be believed. Wilde says, selfishness is when you need everybody to agree with you. They're versions of comparable comments. So Wilde is saying somebody's being very, very selfish when they're deciding what your pleasure should be. And so I think what Wilde is getting at, not in a formalized or a theoretical way, is to say, what would our lives be like if we dropped the whole vocabulary of selfishness and self-centeredness? So that was no longer of any interest to us. So we weren't preoccupied. It's a bit like, I think the best idea in the book is completely unoriginal. The best idea in the book is that it's amazing how much pleasure we can get from each other's company. Now, and most of that pleasure is unforbidden, actually. And yet, the surprising thing in the middle of this is if people were relentlessly vile to each other all the time throughout their lives, of course we just assume that's the way it was. We wouldn't be thinking, oh, this isn't very nice. We'd be thinking, this is the way it is. But actually, we're all sitting here now because somebody has been nice enough to us and we've enjoyed people's company. Now, this book is about the fate of what happens or how you deal with, as you grow up, losing the pleasure in people's company and refinding it or not. But it's not an original virtue idea so much as to say that the reason we're embarked on this project at all is because we really can get pleasure from each other's company. So what matters is what happens to that. So if we were to narrow this to psychoanalysis, and of course it doesn't have to be narrowed to that, it would be like saying the aim of psychoanalysis is to enable the analyst and the patient to enjoy each other's company. And so what's analysed are the obstacles to the pleasure of being with each other. Just that. So that would be like an emblem of this. When Wilde, I think, is talking about the perils of the preoccupation with selfishness, he's talking about a world in which people are all the time monitoring each other's selfishness, as though this is how we are all the time judging ourselves and each other. And this, of course, in some sense, creates the problem it's meant to solve. Because what Wilde is saying is, and of course he isn't the first person to say this, what else could you live from but yourself? But because the background assumption is that this so-called self is mad, bad and dangerous to know, or is full of original sin, so to speak, it's as though we keep proving the thing we always already believe, which is actually we're very, very dangerous to each other. Well, clearly we are dangerous to each other. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that. Nevertheless, people can also be extremely kind to each other. And that's as enigmatic and interesting as the other thing. So the book is just, the wild stuff about selfishness is about, it's a bit like saying, if you start from the principle that we're selfish in that malign way, then you go on seeing it everywhere. And actually it's another very narrow-minded view. Because actually it seems to me you could argue equally plausibly that people are profoundly collaborative. In fact, again, we're all sitting here because our mothers and fathers, or some people who looked after us, were sufficiently not selfless, but selfish in a benign way such that they cared about us. Well, that's all that's being talked about.
I would just want to add, I think that's where there's a considerable convergence between myself and Adam and a sort of understanding of psychoanalysis. That I want to contest the Lacanian assertion that the analyst is the one who's supposed to know. I think both of us would say, no, the analyst is the one who's supposed to enjoy. Another element of the book, again, part of the manifesto, seems to be that we need to address an unforbidden pleasure that you want in some way to problematize. And that is the unforbidden pleasure of living obediently. As if in some way we should eschew that. We should be doing something other than merely submitting to the call to be obedient. Slavoj Žižek says the most obscene form of desire is doing one's duty. And there's something of what you're talking about in the book, writing about, that is very much entangled in that. Again, can you amplify that?
Yeah. In the book, and I quote this, Rowan Williams defines the good as that which is and can be argued about. Now, it seems to me the thing about obedience is it's a conversation stopper. That it's as though at a certain point the conversation stops and people abide by whatever the rules are taken to be. Now, it seems to me there's nothing in and of itself unacceptable about that. It's only unacceptable if it's based on intimidation. So if this book had another title, the book would be Against Intimidation. So what I want to forbid is all kinds of bullying and intimidation and coercion. In this rather utopian view, there's a belief that we're obedient when we're too frightened to speak. And that when we look back on our childhoods or on our pasts, one of the things we can't help but be preoccupied by is what we consented to that we in fact didn't agree with. So in a sense, our histories are the histories of our obedience. And again, this is not an advertisement for psychoanalysis, but one of the things you can do in psychoanalysis is reflect on the history of your own obedience and what function it's had in your life. So that I suppose the book, in a very ordinary, sort of liberal way, is promoting the idea that it's possible to, in conversation with other people, work out which rules you might want to agree to and consent to, and be able to give reasons why that is to somebody who asks you, including yourself, and that this could evolve, so that it's ongoing. Now, I imagine there are certain rules for all of us in this room that we will never outgrow or indeed want to contest. But there may be a whole range of rules that we know have historically evolved. I mean, for example, there was a rule that homosexuality was a sin, for example. Now, all the racism and sexism that I imagine most of us here don't like were based on prior forms of obedience. In other words, things were taken to be uncontestable or undiscussable. So it's partly about a conversation in which you can work out to some extent where you want the conversation to stop. It's a bit like the thing Isaiah Berlin said, you can't prove your first principles, you can only love them. So it's finding out what the sentences are that you might love and might want to abide by until or unless somebody persuades you otherwise.
Again, a third element, crucial element in the book, seems again to be something that is at one level unforbidden, but again that you vehemently seek to problematize. In other words, you're very critical, I think, of the whole issue of self-criticism. In fact, you go on to describe the whole project is in some way a protection racket. It's a way of protecting oneself. Again, I think there's an absolutely sort of marvellous, wonderful culling from Richard III, in which you point to that Shakespeare writes about a cowardly conscience. You seek to differentiate, and I'll be interested in a small elaboration on the differentiation between the superego and a conscience. You say they're analogous, but they're different, and manifestly, because in language they are, there has to be some difference. As I say, I'd like some elaboration on that, but also, if you could expand on this whole idea that in some way, the enjoyment, if it is an enjoyment, a very curious, possibly rather sort of masochistic engagement with this very sort of narrow-minded, these super-egoic accusations that we seem to, in some way, derive a certain degree of meaning from subjecting ourselves to. Manifestly, this is a form of self-love, but what else is going on in all of that?
I mean, my assumption about this is that Freud's superego is an attempt to secularize a more religious idea of conscience. In other words, if the question is, where do the internal authorities come from? Well, Freud's saying they don't come from God. Now, transgenerationally, of course, we've all had, our forebears have been religious. But over time, Freud's saying something along the lines of, well, whatever these religious beliefs are, they've been transmitted and to some extent secularized. So Freud, I'm going to say, the superego does two things. It punishes you and restricts you, and it can also sustain your ideals for you. It gives you a picture of how you ought to be, or of your preferred or better self. But, and I can't remember, I think I say this in the book, that in a way Freud wants the superego to do too much, because it's very difficult to actually talk lucidly about internal authority, partly because, of course, you can only imagine it on the basis of external authority. If you actually now sit and think, what are the internal authorities in my mind? Well, of course, the pictures come from the external world. So it's tricky, this. I think in a way, I don't want to be too precious about this, but there aren't points in the book, there are sentences. The book isn't written with ideas, it's written with sentences. So there isn't more book. I mean, I'm not giving you more book, I'm talking about the book, but the book's in the book. I think one of the things that's sort of said in the book is that two things that strike me. One is the extent to which self-criticism is a refuge. It's a refusal to think about something. It's a refusal to engage, and that looks like a profound engagement. The other thing that struck me, and this is partly from Freud's account, I think, is it might be true that we judge ourselves, or we can only recognize in ourselves what we're capable of judging. So there could be whole swathes of experience, feeling, desire, thought, etc., that are to all intents and purposes invisible because we don't know how to evaluate them. So that's one bit of this. I don't know if that makes sense, but it makes sense to me when I say it. The other bit is that we are very likely, I think, it's almost as though the extreme version of this would be, we've judged ourselves before we found out who we are. So that judgment is privileged over experience in some way. So that internally, we're very, very quick to judge, criticize, assess, evaluate what's going on inside us and between us and other people, at the cost of, or instead of, experiencing it. Now, of course, one of the things that psychoanalysis does, it invites you to suspend your judgment insofar as you're able to. And it does this for what I take to be a very interesting reason, which is you don't actually know the value of what you've said until you say it. But of course, the internal censorship says you know exactly the value of what you've said before you say it. In fact, you only know beforehand. So this is a very different picture of what sort of human interactions could be. So I think in that chapter, I think conscience, or the superego, feeds us our worst lines. I think talking about the superego potentially can feed us our best lines. I think it's that way round.
Okay, I've got another little story. I'm sitting on a train and I'm reading Adam's book. And across the way, sitting at a table, is an attractive young woman, attractive at least in my eyes. And she's very animatedly engaged in a conversation with a young man, a little less attractive in my eyes, but who I take to be the boyfriend. She's got a large tub of what, as far as I can gather, are sort of jelly beans. And she's continually dipping into this tub of jelly beans. The boyfriend is guzzling on 2 large bottles of beer. And they're sitting there, and to all intents and purposes, and this seems to be an unforbidden pleasure for me, I'm taking enormous pleasure in watching these two, who look to me as if they're having a really good time. But what really stands out in this is that on this T-shirt the young woman is wearing, it's got written, "I want more." And given that I'm reading this thing about pleasures and the like, I think this is a rather fitting thing to find myself distracted by. Now I've got sort of 4 readings, and they don't close off any other possible readings at all. I'm sure there are a multiplicity of them, as to quite what that statement might be on about. First reading is that maybe it's just a certain sort of bravado, a sort of, if you like, defense through admission. I think that's what the psychoanalyst would call it. In some way, yes, I'm as greedy as fuck, and what are you going to do about it? That seems one possibility. The other possibility, one that I'm a little less happy with, I think, is that in some way it's a testimony to an experience that looks as if it's got something to do with dissatisfaction. That in some way, that whatever it is that she wanted, there's not been enough. That leads her to want more. It's sort of predicated on some sort of prior disappointment. I say I'm less happy with that potentiality, but clearly it has to exist. A third one is that, and this is what this brings on just a small point in the book, but one that I found myself having some interest in. At one moment in the book, you say that habit is almost always linked to failure. And in some way, and also you go on to say, we should try out other habits. And this, just as I say, it sort of inches a little bit away, a little bit towards my thinking, are we moving just, unfortunately, almost as if you can't, in a way, prevent it happening, to something that seems to be a little bit on the side of an oppressive morality. Because what if the more that she wants is that she's found her way to certain gratifications, certain forms of enjoyment, she just merely wants more. More, in this instance, more of the same. Why would that be a problem? Because it looks as if in the book that in some way sort of limiting the potentiality for a sort of this unknowable multiplicity of potentialities, which is, again, I'm repeating myself, I think, deeply seductive but in some way something seems to get lost in that she may know something of her enjoyments and merely wants more of it. The fourth possibility, the one that I'm in a way most attached to, is that what actually she's saying when she says she wants more is that she wants more wanting, that she wants to go on wanting. And this leads me on to the sort of final thing that I want to raise with you tonight, is that one of the delightful things that you do in the book is that you suggest that maybe we should look for other vocabularies, other words that we might use that would be more faithful to aspects of our experience. And you say, rather than have terms like control, punish, discipline, duty, outcome, these sort of terms, why can't we talk about things that are beautiful, pleasurable, enlivening, so on and so forth? In other words, shifting the vocabulary, which seems always very, very important. And a term that I want to raise, I think a very sort of heartfelt question in relation to, is, and I will return you to a quote of yours. And this is, desire is, I can't read my own writing. Desire is inconceivable without imagining its satisfactions. And it's this word satisfaction that I would like in some way to do away with. Because if I look and think, put my mind to, my enjoyment, the immense pleasure I got from reading your book, it just doesn't make any sense to me that I approached that, my desire to read the book, had anything at all to do with something being satisfied.
No,
I wouldn't know what that would look like.
I agree with that, but I think in a way, we agree with each other more than you may think. Because what I think I'm saying is, desire comes with a fancy of satisfaction as a way of trying to guarantee something that can't be guaranteed. In other words, I'm talking about the first stage. The first stage is I have a wish, and in my sense of this, when you have a wish, it comes somewhere with a picture of satisfaction. And that's actually it quells you, it reassures you, because actually there's an unknowable beforehand satisfaction in the offing. That your desire is taking you in a direction and you cannot know what actually is going to be the consequence of it. So you create an already existing narrative. That's the thing. See, when you...
But I'm not sure that we do. That's what I'm seeking to problematize.
Well, yeah, and I don't know whether we do either. But insofar as we're made anxious by our desire, we might.
We might. That's for sure.
Yeah, we might want to say, actually, I've got the picture of what I want. It's now a question whether I got the wherewithal to find it. I mean, it's like when you said it, I thought of two things, and I don't know if they're related. One is the Mae West thing. Too much of a good thing can be a good thing. But the other thing was the difference between two versions of, I don't know what, but two versions of something, which is in one version, two versions, I suppose, of a dependent self. The happily dependent self thinks how wonderful it is to live in a world where other people have different thoughts and feelings than I do. The unhappily dependent self thinks, shit, why couldn't I have thought of that? Now, they're two very, very different pictures of the world, because in the first picture, you have an open world of unknowable thoughts and feelings that other people might have that you don't know about. In the second version, you've got a closed system where it's all about me. And it's fundamentally all about my envy and all about my deprivation. So I think the book is, I don't know if this quite addresses your point, but the book consciously is on the side of an openness that is not an over-anxious and therefore violent narrowing of the mind and of other people's minds.
Yeah, no, I would utterly concur with that. That, to me, is very much an insistent thrust of the book. It's just that every now and then, it just feels that it's sort of, that you're so eager to promote that, to promote the sort of the wide-angled view of things, an openness, desire as an openness to what comes next, which I think is an impeccable way of understanding desire, which then, of course, just to go back to the minutiae of psychoanalysis, rather problematizes what was Bion on about when his maxim was no memory, no desire. Now, it looks as if then desire is indelibly handcuffed to satisfaction.
And to memory. And to memory.
Right. And that he's saying, that as soon as we're caught up in that, we have certain sort of, rather than objects, internal objects, we have objectives, because the whole issue of satisfaction seems that it's an end game. that you can actually arrive at this, and it's on the side of closure, and that's what's so disappointing about that particular term, and we'd do better to forget about that. Right, what more might we want? Well, questions from the floor, I think, next.
Oh, thank you. Is it possible to unforbid our pleasures?
Yeah.
Good.
I think it is.
Thank you.
Do you need me to say more, or is that?
Yes, I'd like you to say a little bit more. Thank you.
I mean, I imagine that's one of the things that happens in friendship or love affairs or psychoanalysis, which is that previously things that felt unbroachable might become broachable. That things get redescribed in the context of a relationship. They could, of course, be reinforced. I don't mean that it's intrinsic to a relationship, but relationships are going to be organized, I think, around the, as it were, prejudices they're organized to reinforce and to guarantee that nothing changes, and the places where people want change. And so the forbidden becomes at least redescribable, or at least available to be talked about, because the really forbidden is not discussable. It wouldn't occur to you to discuss it. So, and that's where psychoanalysis is potentially quite useful, just in the idea of repression. Is are you able to be aware of what is forbidden you, such that you might be in a position to look at it from different aspects, or have a conversation about it?
So, the goal of psychoanalysis could be unforbidding our pleasures.
Yes, or finding out where we want the forbidding to be, and who we want to do it.
One question. Are there pleasures that would be somewhere on the borderline between the forbidden and the unforbidden? And a basic example would be, say, advertising. That is, on the buses, right, you buy, I don't know, handbag. This is what you're supposed to want. This is not forbidden, but because it costs £2,000, it might be difficult to buy it. But you're encouraged to do this. Or the same with, I don't know, health and safety regulations at work. Where I work, there are even little holes in the doors of offices, so that if somebody wants to kill themselves, they cannot do this, not during the office hours, because somebody else will see them, and they cannot harass anybody sexually until the end of the day. After 6 they can, but not before 6, so that's again somewhere. So I was wondering whether there is any comment on that.
Well, I think that there's a rhetoric that tries to make, by making pleasures sound forbidden, make them sound more exciting, and make us sound more daring and exciting people for having them. So I think that there's a rhetoric around this which is worth being alert to. And again, one of the things the book is about is how these words are deployed both to create pleasure and to create excitement, and also in some ways to attack it. But I think that it seems outrageous not being allowed to commit suicide. That seems to me terrible. But I think it's very likely that the really strong regulations, one of the questions we might want to ask is, whose pleasure is it that we are being obedient, and what kind of pleasure is that? Because on the one hand you think, well, who could argue with health and safety? I mean, it's marvellous there are these benign people around who are concerned for our health and safety. But actually, they may not be. They may actually be concerned for their profit, say. I mean, they could be concerned about lots of things. But in other words, the question is whether you know what you're being obedient to, what the pleasure is in being obedient, and what the pleasures that are being excluded, or the thoughts you can't have by virtue of your obedience. Because obedience becomes second nature, it seems to me. I mean, that's one of the things that happens in growing up.
Could I encourage you just to tell very briefly the story of the traffic lights? Because it's a wonderful, wonderful story.
Just briefly, the story is that in Holland, there was a very, very interesting traffic engineer who had decided that it would be much better on a rather complicated crossing, the roundabout crossing. The official view was, we need lights, obviously. We need traffic lights. Because traffic lights actually enable the flow of traffic. This man says, who was called Moderman, no, actually, it'll be much better if we take away the traffic lights. Because if we take away the traffic lights, people will have to cooperate with each other to make the traffic flow. And that's exactly what happened. So there was much less road rage, much less congestion, and the traffic flowed better. And you can see one of the things the example illustrates is that if you take away the official rule, i.e. the red light, people are much more attentive to each other. It's more like choreography and less like prison. And that's the sort of emblem in the middle of the book about the way in which certain kinds of discipline actually preclude collaboration between people. In fact, they are an attack on people's capacity to collaborate.
You put great emphasis on the difference between forbidden and unforbidden pleasures. It may be my idiosyncratic approach to it, but the word pleasures for me has a slightly undesirable facet to it, even if it's a non-forbidden pleasure.
Do you mean that if it's a pleasure in and of itself, it isn't that impressive?
It might have a slight negative side to it.
Yeah.
It's slightly disreputable. You shouldn't. Really.
Yes, I can see that, but I think I would want to make it reputable. I'd want to persuade you that it's a shame to diminish the pleasure in the word pleasure.
Thank you. I first came to your writing, Adam Phillips, through your preface to Walter Pater's The Renaissance, the Oxford Classics edition, I think. So I've always wanted to ask what drew you to Pater? But the afterword or epilogue, I can't remember what it's called, to that is, of course, the famous Manifesto for Pleasure, which was regarded as extremely shocking at the time. And because Pater has given me so much pleasure, I just wondered if your experience of him has left a lasting influence on your thought and the way you see the world.
He certainly, it was Pater who said habit is a form of failure, incidentally. But it's a very interesting comment. I think this might be a conversation that you and I might have privately, so to speak, because it may not be fascinating to everybody else. But it's certainly true that Pater, as a writer primarily, was very, very important to me, and I really do love a lot of his writing. But of course he was interested, and Pater's quoted in this book, he was interested in it from a very, very different point of view, in the ways in which effectively aesthetic perception is restricted because of a certain kind of disparagement of a repertoire of pleasures. And that Pater, in a way, in his writing, I think, is preoccupied by how evocative language can be. And I think in that there's a fantasy about immediacy, that the writing could evoke bodily feelings. I think that's what he wants to do. And so when he says, the point about looking at an art object, and he also means people, is that they're evocative objects, not informative objects. He doesn't use those words. Is that what we're seeing is what people call up in us. And that it has in it a really interesting idea about reception rather than projection. Of, in a sense, the world making us of a piece with it, rather than us trying to colonize the world. I could go on about this, but anyway, yes, Pater's Renaissance, I think, is fabulous. Oh, sorry.
I can hardly see you here. There is in mythology such a thing as the one forbidden thing. And then the hero goes and does exactly that thing which was forbidden. And the story of Adam and Eve, you can say, is an excellent example of the one forbidden thing. And if the hero or the heroine does that one forbidden thing, things actually begin to happen. And the world is no longer the way it was before. So it's a very good thing to do the one forbidden thing. And also, the one who forbids, if he has any wisdom at all, and we assume that God is full of wisdom, he knew precisely that his one forbidden thing would be broken. I wondered whether you like to comment on this.
No, that's a good summary of 2/3 of my book. The book actually discusses the Adam and Eve story, and the book takes seriously the idea that if you forbid someone to do something, you're instructing them to do it at some level. And that the question is, where's the action? And is it action that you want? If it's a certain kind of action that you want, then you eat from the forbidden fruit. But that really is what the book is about. You don't really need to buy it now, actually.
Thank you. I was wondering about this notion, and I don't know Walter Pater, but I was wondering about the notion of immediacy and the idea of the evocative object. And I'm thinking about what you wrote a long time ago in Terrors and Experts about the difference in psychoanalysis between interpretive objects and evocative objects, and psychoanalysis being thought to be all around about the idea of interpretation, where in fact it could be about evocation. And that, of course, leads to action rather than what I'm going to call the text.
But it could be both, couldn't it? I mean, I think it would be a shame to have to choose here, but I think that an over-interpretive psychoanalysis sort of forgets, in a sense, or tries to forget, the sense in which people are so powerfully evocative to each other in ways that are often very difficult to articulate. That people are having effects on each other. That's the primary thing, that bodies have really powerful effects on each other. And that, in a way, psychoanalysis tries to, in a way, over-formalize that by being able to translate, and the risk is to translate too quickly, the effect people are having on each other.
I was also reminded slightly of another Victorian writer, Matthew Arnold, and his idea of Hellenism and Hebraism, and the Hellenic idea of sweetness and light and of playing over things. Because I'm kind of intrigued, this difference between more and most. Often what we care about most, what we want most, is something we've solidified in our head. Often value systems, things we can't actually interact with. And you seem to be criticising that, in that obviously what we want more, rather than what we want most, what we care about more, might be something of the moment, something with a goal and a trajectory. But I'm intrigued by this idea of where's, it's an old-fashioned word, morality in this, whereby one's decided what one cares about most, maybe through experience. That, are you saying that's part of habit, possibly?
It could be. I mean, Arnold is the other third of the book, in a sense. And that bit of Arnold that you referred to. I think the book is, from my point of view, all about morality. It's about nothing else that I can see, because pleasure is all about morality. It couldn't be about anything else, which is, what we want and believe we should be able to do with each other. I don't think, I'm not personally against the monumentalizing of moralities. I'm just against the idea that's what morality really and intrinsically needs to be. And so it's not a sort of, it's really incredibly simple, this. It's about the possibility of looking at the monument. It's a bit like a piece of sculpture. If you walk around it, it's different from different aspects and angles. Well, that's all the book does. It walks around familiar cultural objects in a way, and I give you my impressions. And there's more to it than that, but it's sort of that. And so it's really saying, what happens to our perception and our feelings and our desires if we live in a state of considerable intimidation and fear? It's a version of the Lang question. Why are people so frightened of each other? Well, it seems to me it's a good question. And it's easy to say why we are frightened of each other, but less easy to say why we might not need to be. And I think one of the ways we intimidate each other is through morality. Doesn't mean, therefore, we need to get rid of morality, but we might be interested in finding less intimidating forms of morality. That seems to be a good project. Yeah.
Do you think that coming to a better understanding of our pleasures, whether they're forbidden or unforbidden, tends to kill them?
It can do. I mean, I think I'm personally in favour of experimentation rather than knowledge. Again, we don't have to choose here, but I think that there's a limit to what you can know about pleasure beforehand. But I also know that we've all had, by virtue of being babies and young children and so on, we know an awful lot about pleasure and pain. So we're really expert hedonists by 4. So this issue is absolutely integral, I think. I can't imagine being a person and some way not that being a fundamental axis or parameter around which you organize your experience. So I think the question, the way leading on from your question, is what knowledge is worth having in the enhancement of pleasures that we value? Because lots of knowledge could be fear of pleasure, an attack on pleasure, or just redundant. It could be like those who can do and those who can't teach. It could be a version of that.
Can you hear me? I wondered if you haven't, neither of you and very few of you in the audience either, have mentioned the differences between the seeking of pleasure by women and by men, which in my experience of now a very long life, some of which you know about, it can be extremely difficult to ally all of those pleasures that men seek and women seek, or women desire or want, and I just think that's one of the absences from the discussion. I haven't yet read your book, but I think it's, when I'm listening to all of you, I think, crikey, my stepfather abused me as a child, and I can remember feeling things from it, but I didn't desire it because I was too young to know what was going on. And I think to ignore that difference between what women desire from life and their bodies and the bodies of their children, and what men see when they have small children and so on, is to ignore something, certainly for me, was really, really, really devastating.
I think talking about pleasure in this abstract way has to oversimplify things. But in a way, what the book and I am on the side of is precisely, I think, what you're talking about, which is there being conversations in which people can differentiate and talk more in more heartfelt ways about pleasure and being able to differentiate them. Because there isn't something called pleasure. There's a whole range of bodily experiences and feelings that get corralled into the word pleasure. Whereas, of course, it's really profoundly differentiated. It's different for every person. But we've only got the vocabulary we've got. And it seems to me, one of the things the book wants to do is to extend the possibility of that vocabulary in exactly the direction you suggest, which is that everything gets homogenized, or everything gets too narrowly described and prescribed. And I think this is one of the consequences of Forbidden Pleasures having stolen the show, is that it's as though pleasure has been grossly oversimplified and been used in rather a tyrannical way. Whereas actually everybody's experience is a combination of very different, very various, and to differing degrees articulable. So I want the thing you describe, but I think it's a struggle for people. You've got to, in order to be articulate, you've got to have somebody who can listen to you, because the talk's always as good as the listener.
You used the phrase narrowing the repertoire a bit earlier, and I was wondering whether and that harks a little bit back to your previous book, Missing Out, I think, in The Unlived Life. And I wonder whether narrowing the repertoire, whether that be in terms of creating habits of forbidden pleasures, like someone like Jean Genet, creating a forbidden universe in which he kind of rejects normal society, or unforbidden pleasures, habits of unforbidden pleasures. To what degree you would think that might be an aesthetic activity rather than an ethical activity, given that you quote Wilde on that score?
I think my prejudice is to think that that the temptation to aestheticize morals is potentially very evasive. Because for me, my preferred language would be a kind of aesthetic and moral language, but not using one to displace the other. So when Wilde says, for example, it's much more important to have a good colour sense than to know the difference between good and evil, I think it's a fantastically interesting way of putting it. And I think it makes you then think, well, what might the connection between these two things be? But at the end of the conversation, I want to have a better sense of good and evil. I also want to have a better colour sense, but I want to have a better sense of good and evil. perhaps on that note, unless somebody's got one more desperately urgent question. Landed with the last question.
Okay. I'm asking this question, Adam, because in your Paris Review interview, you said at the end that if you'd not been into psychoanalysis, you thought you might have liked to have been a primary school teacher. And I am a primary school teacher. And of course, as a primary school teacher, I have to do a fair bit of forbidding and asking for obedience. It's not all I do, but I have to do that. You might not have liked it. The point I would like to make about forbidden pleasures is a sort of point about almost their banality, certainly in the context where I'm forbidding or asking for obedience. That is, a lot of the things that children would like to do are very pleasurable for them, and I'm forbidding them simply because it's incompatible with other things going on. They would love to run around the classroom screaming, but it would be incompatible with other children learning. And also, a lot of the things they'd like to do are quite predictable. So just a note about that forbidden pleasures may not be that dramatic and dark, simply rather predictable and boring.
But all the things you've described seem to me to be incredibly interesting. I mean, the fact that the children want to run around, and you obviously understandably want to contain them. I mean, this is the story of our lives. We wanted to run around, and they wanted to stop us. That's what acculturation is. But it seems to me in the middle of that, it's worth wondering both what you're doing and what they're doing. I mean, Anna Freud says, if you let adults talk about anything they want, they talk about sex. If you let children do whatever they want, they become violent. Now that's really interesting, if it's true. It's really interesting. So what are these creatures that, without adult containment, want to do all these things? And of course, we are those creatures. And of course, it's entirely intelligible that there's a sense in which we know much more about life than they do, and we've got to protect them from themselves. The question then, I think, becomes, how long do people go on being protected from themselves, and who by? Because it seems to be very important to do what you've described yourself doing. It would be terrible if you enjoyed, sadistically, confining them. And it would be terrible if they went on to be very, very obedient adults, in my view. But those primary school experiences are absolutely, they're the point. That's where it all starts. And I think when you say they're banal, I think they're banal in the very best sense. What is it we want to stop children doing? And why? It's a really interesting question. So, I wish I was doing your job, and I'm glad I don't.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you very much, Chris. One of the great unforbidden pleasures, of course, is reading. So please do come and buy a copy of Adam's books, or any books you like, and hang around and have a chat. Thank you again.
Thank you, Adam. You're great.